Hi, Lexi. I know we talked a little bit before, but still, can you like introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah. My name is Lexi Bence. I'm the head of strength and conditioning for the Colorado Avalanche in the NHL. I just finished my second season with the team. Prior to that, I spent 7 years with the Pittsburgh Penguins, also in the NHL, and then worked in the private sector training hockey players. So I've been training hockey players and athletes from other sports, but predominantly hockey for about 15 to 20 years now. And so it's been a fun ride, and it was a great season this year, and I'm excited to be on the podcast now.
Nice, nice, nice. Obviously, I barely work with ice hockey before, so it's probably a stupid question, but can you share with me like the speed training aspect for ice hockey?
It's a great question because there's a lot of literature out there on speed, and a very, very high percentage of it is ground-based or field-based. You got your Australian rules football, rugby, Premier League soccer, NFL basketball. There's a lot of great athletes who run on their feet on the ground on cleats or shoes or whatever. But when you put skates on and you start playing hockey on the ice, it absolutely adds a completely different demand. And I think you couple that, and it's the only sport really that kind of does that. You combine that with the gear and the equipment that makes it more difficult to sort of wear wearables or collect biomechanical data. And then you combine that with the game is played on such a large field with so many open changes and unpredictable situations that collecting research level or research quality data has been very challenging, I think. There's a few practitioners who have started to do a little bit better job. I'll give a good shout out to Matt Price, formerly of the LA Kings, who's done some great work, I think, with his products and with 1080. And I think we're starting to learn a little bit more about speed training on the ice. But for me, the speed training is always a sort of a complex intersection between, the muscular level with rate of force production and muscle contraction, with the nervous system and, the speed of the contraction and conductivity, and then, how the player is able to apply the force on the ice in the specific plane of motion, whether it's a forward stride, a pivot stride, a crossover, a backward stride, a return. And I think that's where the speed element gets lost a lot. And I've had the most fun sort of learning and diving into is how does the individual technique or the individual movement signature of every player impact their ability to create speed in certain situations on the ice. And so I've always been kind of drawn to that myself, and that's especially at the NHL level, where most of these guys are pretty big, pretty strong, pretty fit because they're further down that developmental curve. Individual techniques and minor nuances to their movement quality and movement strategies can sometimes make a really big difference in producing speed on the ice.
Nice. So, and I recently learned this. I don't know if this is true or not, but like they're saying like strength coach was not allowed to do speed training on ice like 10 years ago. It was a thing like probably like recent, like started like 5 to 10 years recently.
Mhm.
Is that okay?
I don't actually know if they, quote, weren't allowed or if it wasn't common practice. The rise of products like 1080 Sprint 2 for, on ice speed work has definitely grown in the past, 5 or 6 years, call it. And it's starting to become a little bit more popular, but I think, and there's almost two schools of thought, and that is, some strength coaches believe in training the underlying physical qualities. It's all about force production, maximum rate of force production, or it's about aerobic capacity or anaerobic capacity, alactate capacity, things like that. And how do we train all of those individual capacities to then make them better on the ice? And then other player or other practitioners such as myself, I look at it as a little bit more of a complex problem, and say that it's about how those qualities are applied on the ice. And when we learn more about those movement strategies of really good players, we see that there are a lot of different ways to accomplish speed or create speed on the ice. It's not always as cut and dry as some people might want it to be. And I think strength coaches around the league can find tons of examples of very strong, very powerful athletes who just can't quite translate that onto the ice, or vice versa. Somebody who is not overly, good in the gym with their power production or force production, but can move and create force and power on the ice so easily and effortlessly. And those might be anomalies, they might be outliers, or they might just be speaking to a greater or a part of the game that's a little bit less understood, and that's the impact of the technical side of hockey or the movement strategy side of hockey with those underlying or underpinning qualities of, force production and power production.
Nice, nice. Uh, Followed by speed development. Obviously, like in the past few years, like basketball, American football, like all sorts of team sport are looking into like the deceleration or change of direction aspect uh training.
Mhm.
But I was talking to another strength coach, work for hockey. They say like this ice hockey doesn't really have the same change direction or deceleration like basketball or football. Talk to me
Mhm.
about that.
I think it's a really great observation by that, whoever that sort of strength coach was, because I think the game of hockey is one out like similar to basketball in the sense that, it's open. It can be subject to, what tactical strategy of the other team or positioning on the ice, but the change of direction demands, change from player to player, position to position, from game to game. And, you know, starting and stopping from a complete stop and starting again is very challenging. So players try to avoid that as much as possible. Now, coaches might say, "Hey, you need to stop on pucks. You need to stop and start." But it's the cost of doing that is certainly much higher than if you're able to turn or if you're able to maintain speed. And you'll see some players are really good at that. Whether that's their style of playing, whether that's a good thing tactically, their coaches might disagree, but their ability to conserve energy and conserve speed, I think, can change the deceleration or the change of direction demands. And you'll see that a lot just simply between like a centerman who plays the middle of the ice and kind of loops both sides to support versus a right winger or a left winger who might have to stop and start, to be in the necessary position. Just the nature of that position is going to fundamentally change the acceleration profile, the deceleration profile, the change of direction demands. And that's kind of just based on the neutral zone, the defensive zone. When you get into the offensive zone, some players are doing a lot of their work or their productivity comes off the rush when they're at high speed. So they're trying to maintain motion. Others do a lot of work, what we call down below the dots or low in the corners when there is a lot more stop and start and spinning off of players and rolling off of players. And that creates almost a style of play that is more conducive to one or the other. And that then raises the question of, if you're going to train this athlete, do you want to lean into their strengths, improve their weaknesses, or some version of the two? Do they need to be faster in open ice? And do they need to create more off the rush? Or do they need to become more of a dangerous player or more of a threat when they're moving off a cycle and stopping and starting and transitioning from, going right, left, or a crossover, or a pivot, something like that? And that then speaks to their style of play on the ice, what they want their style to play to be, what their coaching staff or development staff want them to be, or the type of player, and then how they want to play and what they need to work on. That I think ultimately plays back into the demands of how you would train that athlete.
Nice, nice. Um, I'm gonna nerd out a little bit here. Um, I think like in the past few days, obviously I was at Speed Summit and there are some hockey strength coaches there that are talking about like the way hockey player move just so different than the way they move on ice. The way they sprint on ice is so different than just sprinters, football player. So that's probably like a lot of their hip structure probably change when they're at like probably high school or college. Do you kind of see the same thing? And like, yes.
Absolutely. I think regrettably, I think, the rise of hip replacement surgeries or, labral reconstructions, FAI, CAM and pincer lesions, things like that, sports hernia, growing, adductor avulsions, things like that. Those are probably higher now than they've ever been in the game of hockey. Partially that is due to players being faster, playing the game at a higher pace, training, probably more intensely. Not always maybe in the most advantageous way, but trying to prioritize things that maybe they should be redirecting some focus in other areas, such as hip health or maintenance of those key structures. But the movement, like those other coaches are saying, and I'm jealous you got to go to the Speed Summit. I think the people at 1080 do a tremendous job. And I know a good friend of mine, Matt Price, who was in the is in the NHL or was in the NHL and works with 1080, does a phenomenal job. So I can only imagine how great that summit was. but the movement of hockey is just is so different. If you look at the contraction time with the blade on the ice relative to the ground contact time of a sprinter or a rugby player or Australian rules football or football, NFL football, they're just so different. And then I think the biggest difference for me that I think people realize but don't fully appreciate is, the majority of that motion is when you're running is forward, it's in the sagittal plane and your counterbalancing forces is mostly in the sagittal plane. There is some frontal and some transverse moments for sure, but the majority of it is, in the sagittal plane. And there's so much more movement in the frontal plane for a hockey player who's doing hip extension through abduction or who's doing a crossover motion and doing hip extension through adduction and internal rotation. Those are just significantly different moves than a skater than a sprinter running straight ahead or a running back and running straight ahead. Now, there's probably more commonalities when you're skating and stopping and, running and stopping. If you're a running back coming out of the backfield who's making a cut to, juke to the side and avoid the lineman, there's probably a lot more similarities there, but the essence of the running stride versus the skating stride just has so much more motion in the frontal plane that I think then creates different stability, mobility, and movement demands in other areas of the body, such as the hip, the thoracic spine, stabilizing through the pelvis, stabilizing through the contralateral glute. I think those things become so much more impactful. And when you train an athlete or you look at an athlete through the lens of a sprinter or a football player or a ground-based or sagittal-based, running sport player, I think you're going to miss a few things that are really important to the performance of that athlete, but probably the long-term health of those key structures in the hip, the pelvis, the groin, the sports hernia related issues, pubic symphysis, things like that.
Nice. I love it. I'm glad that you brought up uh adductor, groin, those type of injury, because I work with basketball, and we used to like in the back we don't deal with a lot of like hamstring, groin, or calf. Somehow there's more and more in the past few years, and I know like you guys been dealing with groin, adductor, all the like hip, labrum, all those type of injury for a long time. So uh I think if you look at it, not hockey, but basketball,
Mhm.
if you look at basketball players' groin injury in a biomechanics lens, a lot of it is like their hip is out not aligned. Like one side's probably more posterior tilted, one side's more anterior tilted, or some sort of SI joint issue or scoliosis. But there are some other people that say the adductor is not strong enough. So talk to me about like your experience with handling these type of injury. I feel like as a basketball strength coach, we can learn more from you guys in terms of these type of injury.
No, I appreciate you saying that, and I think it probably goes both ways. With we don't see a ton of Achilles tendinopathy or patellar tendinopathy, but I have had a few cases of patellar tendon issues, maybe not full on tendinopathies, but some definitely some athletes dealing with some issues there. And I think my NBA colleagues, there's a great staff at the Nuggets that I've collaborated with a little bit, and throughout the NBA, I know there's a ton of great practitioners who could teach me probably a lot about tendon health and tendon maintenance and tendon repair, just because you guys deal with that so much more. But we definitely deal with a lot of adductor injuries. And I do think that's a common question I get and a common thing that people think about is the adductor is weak. And if I've seen 30 growing injuries, 50 growing injuries over the course of my career, there's probably only been a handful, and I'm talking on one hand, that were probably caused by a weak adductor, or the adductor itself was too weak to produce or absorb the necessary amount of force. I personally don't think you see that very often. Um, I've also used great technologies like the force frame and other, methods for measuring growing strength. And I've seen absolute numbers in the 800 newtons, and I've seen them in the 150 newtons. And both those athletes have no growing injuries. Sometimes the 800 has a lot of growing injuries. The 150 hasn't had one in his whole career, and he's been playing in the league for 10 years. So I don't think you can draw a straight line between adductor strength and adductor health necessarily. But what I have seen a lot more, and this is why I think these adductor injuries, um, I kind of lump them in with sports hernia, with pubic symphysis, with that pain or that discomfort of those issues, because I look at the process as a chain. Excuse me. And if you're trying to produce force or absorb force through that chain, then that force needs to be produced or absorbed equally. If there is a mobility restriction or a lack of range of motion that is not occurring, and that range of motion or that force production or force absorption goes to another part of the tissue, now you're getting disproportionate loading, and the weak link in the chain is always going to crack first. That is most often the adductor, I think, and we tend to see a lot more adductor longuses than brevis or magnus or pectineus or anything like that. I think longus is probably the biggest, the most commonly injured adductor specifically. But I think that the amount of force going through that longus at the moment that it ruptures or tears or suffers the injury is not probably because it's too weak to handle that, but it's because too much force is going through that area, whether because the same side of the ipsilateral hip is locked up, is not moving. There's a tremendous amount of internal rotation demand in the hockey stride, particularly in the crossover. So if you're unable to get into internal rotation and create adduction on a crossover, that motion has to go somewhere else. You're going to lose some hip extension, which means the adductor probably has to pick up some of that slack. And that's when we tend to see issues. The other part that's been really interesting for me is, we talked about the role or the difference between, sagittal based running and the frontal plane of skating. And I think the role of the thoracic spine in creating balance through the hockey stride and counteracting the movement of that lower limb is so important. And, our society in general, I think, is the computer is in front of you, your keyboard, your cell phone, your food, everything's in front of you, creating kind of that kyphotic, that rounded posture that is prone to reducing thoracic rotation. And when a player loses the ability to rotate through the thoracic spine, they start to create motion in the lumbar spine. We get back injuries. But if they lose that range of motion in the thoracic spine, especially if they lose it asymmetrically, then I think that movement is then, or that force gets dispersed through that chain, disproportionately falls on the adductor, and we see that pop up. So I've had multiple athletes where I can almost plan it accordingly and say, okay, his right hip locked up. 2 days later, his left T-spine rotation locked up. Then 2 days later, his left groin started to get sore. And I can almost just tell it's one that feeds the other. So if we as a group of practitioners can better understand the movement qualities and the demands of that skating stride and how those three pieces, the hip, the pelvis, the adductor, and then the thoracic spine, if all those pieces are working together in kind of a unified system or unified chain, I think we're going to be fine. But when one of those links goes off because your hip might get jammed up because you fell or you got hit or you blocked a shot on your ankle or you slept funny. It could happen for a variety of reasons. That's the nature of elite sport, I think, is these things crop up all the time. But when the chain becomes affected, somewhere it's going to get overloaded, whether it's producing force or absorbing force. And I think the adductor takes the brunt a lot of the time. So I look at it less as a strength issue with the adductor and more as a movement problem that is manifesting in the adductor. And I think I've seen that now enough through the course of my career that when a player presents with an adductor injury or a hip injury or something like that, the first thing I want to check is the movement strategy. How are they executing ankle, knee, and hip flexion, hip extension, and then kind of go from there and work the process.
Nice. Uh, this is not related, but I was talking to Adam Virgil la
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, and he said, "I'm gonna have a lot of fun talking to you because you're like crazy smart." He's not wrong. I feel like we're gonna be best friends.
Wonderful.
So
That's
let me
great
share
too,
with
because I don't know if I'd give a big shout out to Adam because I think he does tremendous work, and I've always enjoyed sort of reading his work. But I don't think I've had the pleasure of sort of interacting with him or communicating with him too much. So you might have to connect me and Adam
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
I'd love to pick his brain as well too. I think the more I just love surrounding myself with smart people who can teach me something or tell me something I don't know or prove me wrong, because then it's another opportunity to further understand the problem.
yeah. You guys are crazy smart. So, uh, this is interesting because obviously can't say the name, but like one of our guys, we signed a guy during the season, and like he played for us for like the second game, and then he had doctor said he got grade 2 groin sprain. I was
Okay.
like, okay, okay. Then I so I literally just text Dan Path like, hey coach, this is what happened. What should I do? He said, check his SI joint, check his pelvis, and check his hip internal rotation on both sides.
Yeah.
And like you said, there's the other side is actually very limited, and his SI is off. So after we fixed that, no pain at all. Was able to play the next day throughout the season.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
that's we see that in hockey all the time. And we're also, both of us with the, the business or the teams that we work for, we travel a lot. You spend 2 hours in the air at odd times. You're going to sleep at night in different beds. Like there is so many opportunities for hips to become locked up, to lose a little bit of internal rotation, thoracic rotation to become limited, SI to become, out of alignment or out of position. Those things crop up every day. And I think that's just, again, the nature of pro sports and elite sports. And it's not a bad thing then when that happens. But if you can improve across your team of practitioners and say, look, here's what we're looking at. We want to make sure internal rotation is clear, thoracic rotation is clear. Glute activation is working. The movement pattern is clean. Ankle, knee, and hip working together. If those things are all in line and you're checking those boxes, then they're probably in a relatively limited, risk of injury, or they probably don't have an elevated risk of injury. And we all know those guys who are higher risk and they tend to lock up faster, or they tend to have bad sleep, so they're poor recoverers, whatever the issue might be. And you just know that, hey, I have to check this guy's right hip every day, because the second that goes, the groin's not going to be far behind, and we can't afford to lose him for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it is. So as we all collectively improve our understanding of that, I think we'll get better at that process.
this is fun. I really enjoy this. This is fun. So,
I love talking about this stuff too.
yeah,
Growing injuries in hockey is one of the most interesting things for me. And I've been really fortunate to work with some great, great practitioners. Like I don't know Dan as well as you, but the limited times that I have, Dan's always great enough to chat and talk shop. And he's given me great insights. And Andy O'Brien, I spent a lot of time with, who's a brilliant, brilliant practitioner. Matt Jordan out of the University of Calgary, Bill Knowles out of Knowles Reconditioning in Philadelphia. I've been fortunate to get, spend some time as a fly on the wall with some of the smartest and most
yeah,
brilliant sort of rehab minds. And I'm very fortunate for that. So getting a chance to talk about it is always fun for me.
yeah. You're like, it's not. There's not a lot of strength coach out there think the way like Dan,
Yeah.
and the way you explain grind is really making me like excited. I was like, this is really exciting.
That's awesome. I love
Yeah.
it.
So, obviously, like biomechanic, like since we're talking about groin and the way you explain it, it's really through a applied biomechanics lens. Um, Talk to me about biomechanics in ice hockey. I know a lot of teams starting to do like track sprinting motion, their curve, change of direction or shooting.
Mhm.
Talk to me about your thoughts on the whole. Obviously, you can't share like whatever you do, but like talk to me about your thoughts on the whole biomechanics testing. What should a biomechanist do if he interact with hockey players, and what are the things like you're looking at?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually there's a couple companies who are, I think, in the very early stages of trying to look into this stuff. And like I said at the start, one, hockey is just such a small subpopulation of the elite sporting market. Two, the equipment makes it really difficult to put like markers and stuff on. And then three, it's not like you can put someone in a Vicon system and watch them throw a pitch and you can see every dot. Like the rink is massive, and to wire a whole building for that is virtually impossible. So collecting biomechanical data is almost non-existent to this point. Um, but what I will say, because we don't have a ton of research on that, there's some good research out of the Ice Hockey Laboratory in McGill in Montreal, Canada. I think they've done some interesting work. Now they do it on, I think, synthetic ice in a very confined space, which again I think already sort of changes the element or the demand. Um, the biomechanics, I've maybe I've been around the Dans of the world too long, but just kind of watching movement and watching key movement patterns gives me a sort of a broader snapshot of their biomechanics versus specific joint angles and range of motions and torque at this joint versus that joint. So when I look at an athlete, a hockey player in particular, and I want to assess, do they have any major red flags for movement quality or biomechanical issues? can they drop into a reverse lunge sort of position? And are they getting flexion at the ankle, knee, hip? All are those three joints working together? Not uncommon for a lack of dorsiflexion in a hockey player. You know, you lock your foot into a pretty tight boot that restricts dorsiflexion. Then you couple that with your foot being sort of squished into a skate, and then training over the years. And you know, a lot of hockey players don't have great dorsiflexion, so when they go down into those positions, depending on the skater, depending on the style, the depth of that sort of ankle, knee, and hip flexion can change a lot. But I think, you know, you want to see that those are working together. So when a player drops down, is their chest parallel to their shin? A very simple, very crude, but easy to tell. No, you know what? Their shin is too vertical, their torso is too flexed. This is not a symmetrical position. It's going to be very difficult for them to fire ankle, knee, and hip eccentrically or concentrically and then produce force in a uniform way. That those biomechanics are off for me. That's something I would want to work on. Now, that might be improving quad strength to help them sit deeper. Maybe it's manual treatment work on the foot or the ankle to increase dorsiflexion, or maybe it's just simple coaching. They've never been told to keep their chest and their shin parallel. I want you to drop into this position versus this position. And that's kind of a key biomechanical constraint for me. And then the other one, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the hockey sort of hips and issues we talked about, but I think in hockey you have to be able to load into or sit into your hip in a smooth and uniform way. And by that I mean you need to be able to get your center of mass as close to being right over top of your base of support and over top of that hip joint as you can. Kind of that nose over knee over toe or chest over your arch, whatever kind of cue the coach likes to use. But the idea that a player, you know, if their base of support is outside of their shoulders and they can only shift over and not really get it over on top, well, then I think that creates almost some dynamic impingement every time they shift between their skates and try to get into that range of motion. So to me, I would say the biomechanics of that movement is probably off without knowing any specific joint angles or the relative torque or force anywhere. I just, this doesn't look right to me. And you know, Dan's got the best coach's eye in the world, and I'm just consistently blown away at the things he can see and figure out. But I think, you know, it's kind of looking at it through that Dan lens and saying something's just not moving right here. Um, and then the only other thing I would add to that is I've as I've kind of gone down the biomechanics rabbit hole and tried to look at different technologies and different movement strategies, excuse me, I've seen healthy athletes and non-healthy athletes, powerful, not powerful, great skaters and bad skaters, all show very different skating styles. So if you even ask me what should a hockey stride look like from a biomechanical standpoint with degrees of ankle flexion, hip, knee, all that, I'm not even sure I could tell you. And I've looked at a lot of skating strides just because I think players and their individual movement signature can vary so much and still be tremendously effective. And that could be because of anthropometric, you know, things that they can't change. It could be a training history. It could be an injury they're trying to avoid or that's already there. You know, you might be dealing with a player who already has cam lesions or pincer lesions, and maybe they're not so symptomatic that they can't play, but they're there. So you have to respect that and work around that. That's going to impact the way you train them or look at their biomechanics relative to somebody who's got, you know, pristine, clean hips. Or, you know, you look at I don't like to go down the goalie route very often because they're such a different player and position and almost a different sport than the skaters. But those hips are going to be tremendously different, as is the movement demand. So the more I watch people produce unbelievable amounts of force and power and, you know, fluidity and you know, skating ability in different ways, I'm blown away at how complex the biomechanical process can be, but still be successful and be tremendously successful. So there's a couple basically broad biomechanical things I look for, like to talk about the shin torso, you know, sitting into your hip, things like that. But from a very specific biomechanical lens, at least for now, looking at it more precisely or with more data would probably take too much time or be too much effort relative to the reward or the, you know, I don't think the juice would be worth the squeeze kind of thing, at least at this point, until we're able to maybe learn a little bit more, which might come from, you know, somebody doing some great work and really looking closer at some of the key biomechanical characteristics.
Nice. I'm gonna echo what you just said. I think 2 weeks ago I was at Myers Institute of Sport,
In
and
Philly?
then no, Myers at LA.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, they work with Kings, uh
Yep.
Kings
Okay.
and Galaxy,
Yep.
and obviously Lakers. Probably
Mhm.
shouldn't say that, but whatever.
Yep.
Uh, but what Susan was saying, like it's so hard to use all those data when it comes like linear or lateral movement because everybody moves differently. Healthy or not, everybody kind of have their own movement signature. So it's
Absolutely.
almost impossible to like say, oh, he moved this way, so he's gonna get injured just from the data.
Absolutely. And I don't, the viewers of this podcast might be a little bit more interested in hockey, so they might know some of the names, but some people might not. But we take two, we're fortunate enough to have, in my opinion, two of the best skaters in the world on our team, and Nathan McKinnon and Cale Makar. But they go about creating that power and that movement quality in different ways. And then a lot of other people would say that Connor McDavid is, again, one of the best, if not the best, skaters in the world. And I think Connor also goes about it in a different way as well. So you're talking about the three most, arguably the three best, most dominant skaters, and they kind of go about that process of creating speed or creating lateral motion or creating deception with their movement in different ways. And again, that just speaks to the individual movement signature of each athlete. Now, all three of those guys, I think, are tremendously gifted athletes, and they just naturally are able to do things better than others, which is great, and it certainly helps them. But it also just speaks to there's more than one way to create speed and create power and create effective movement on the ice, and that's a very classic question from a general manager or a scout or player development who's like, this guy needs to get faster. He needs to work on his first three steps. Well, okay, what's wrong with his first three steps? If it's a younger, if it's a 17-year-old, 18-year-old kid, he might just not have enough muscle mass to, produce enough force to be faster at the NHL level. If it's an older player, he might be, very inefficient at how he produces or transfers that sort of power from his quads and his glute into the foot, into the blade, into the ice. And then there's other skaters who maybe they just can't move their feet fast enough. So there's a different reason behind everybody's speed or lack of speed. And I think it's about understanding where that speed comes from and then trying to figure out, well, based on this movement signature, where the areas of opportunity, where could they get a little bit better, or where do we need to lean into? This is their style. Let's make that even better. Um, and that's always a fun puzzle to dissect. That's part of the job that I really love.
Nice, nice. All right. Next topic I want to ask is related to sports science or the term load management. Um, Obviously feel like basketball world would kind of swing too far on that end to like everybody's been criticizing like almost every team out there, just like, oh, like he should play. Why isn't he playing all that stuff?
Yeah.
And obviously that's not the case for football and soccer. What
Yep.
about ice hockey? Because I know almost nothing about ice hockey. So,
Mhm.
in terms of load management, like how would you handle like the travel, the practice, all those games?
Yeah. I think that's a great question and a hot topic kind of thing, especially in the NBA. But in the NHL, load management isn't really a thing. I think it's kind of the sort of the culture of hockey, and just, you don't get days off. You play, you know what I mean? You play through injury, you play. That's every player is a little bit different, every organization and team's a little bit different, but there's a little bit more of that culture of, you play and you play through it and you have to be ready every game. The most interesting thing to me about the load management conversation is I feel like people very often talk about it almost strictly as like a games thing. Like the only place that you accumulate or load is in a game. And yes, games are obviously very intense. Like no one would dispute that. But I think if you take a step back and you zoom out from that athlete's life and you look at it as sort of inputs and outputs, there's a tremendous amount of output when they play the game, but there's also output if it's basketball, shoot around in the morning, when they do a gym session, when they travel, when they sleep. And then there's practices, there's soft tissue treatment, there's strength training, there's mobility. The sum total of all of these actions, I think, should come together into what that load is. So if a player wants to play 82 games, depending on the player, depending on the injury, depending on the issue, depending on their history, etc., maybe they're able to play all 82 games, but they can't practice on any other day. Because if we're going to balance the output needed to play 82 games, we need to pull off somewhere else, or we need to upregulate retreatment, recovery, or treatment, recovery modalities. Maybe they need to spend more time using a modality like a hyperbaric chamber and sitting in there, or they need to spend more time getting soft tissue work on the table, or they need to spend more time prioritizing their sleep schedule and letting that person sleep in later and coming up with a little bit of a different schedule. I think people often forget that sort of the allostatic load on an individual is the sum total of a lot of things. So, it's like we need this guy to be playing all his games, but we also need him to work out. We also need him to, come to morning skate. We need him to do media. We need him to do all these things. Excuse me. And rather than pulling off the games as the first thing, what are we doing in all other aspects of their life? And fortunately here, our staff and our organization has done, I think, a very good job of accepting that. We have a lot of players who play big minutes, who are very dynamic. And, we've done a really good job. And I give our coach so much credit because I think he's incredibly attuned with our players and has a great relationship with them and really knows where almost every player on the team is at. And he knows when to push and when not to push. And sometimes you just got to let them stay home. Sometimes you let them come in for recovery. Sometimes you don't let them stay home. So they do come in and get recovery, whether it's soft tissue treatment or red light therapy or hyperbaric or whatever you might have access to. But that again is monitoring kind of their overall allostatic load across the day, the week, the month, the season. And I think there's a lot of levers that you can pull in the load management scenario before you have to get to games. And I think that's just and that's not to say, look, in some situations, you might have to sit players out from games, whether, if they have a really bad Achilles tendon or a really bad knee tendon that's just not responding, it's fired up, they can't do it. That happens. But, for most people, especially in the NHL, it's okay, well, how can we pull off on other days and basically do as little work as we possibly can or that minimal effective dose that they're still in a great place when it comes time to game? Because I think if you asked every general manager, player, coach, whoever, it's like, I'll tell you what, I'll be really bad every day, but I'll be really great every game night. They'd be like, sure, I'm good. That's fine. As long as you're ready for the game, be ready for the game. And I think you just need to take a step back or zoom back and recognize the inputs and all of the inputs and all of the outputs, and then start to pull some of those levers before it's we need to sit this player out of the game kind of thing.
Nice, nice. Um, Obviously, like you guys play a lot of games. How many games you guys play? 80?
We played 82 last year. Next season, I believe, is going to be the first year to go to 84.
Damn, that's crazy.
A lot of
Uh,
games.
yeah. So obviously, like 82 games for you guys, 82 games for us. Um, Basketball have been doing this game deadlift. Well, most of the team doing game deadlift a lot. Like some team do their own stuff, but uh, for you guys, do you guys do game deadlift or how do you microdose lift during the season?
Uh,
This is a stupid one, but
no, no, no. I think it's a great question. And what's most interesting to me is this past season with the Avalanche, we kind of rolled out a little bit of a different plan than I have in my previous sort of 8 years or 9 years. And I think that was just more the way the group was structured, the way our schedule was structured. And what we ended up doing was, depending on the day, it's if we had a day off and then a practice, we'd often lift before practice, use it as a little bit of a primer, low volume, higher intensity, good warm up, try to get a little bit of a lift in there. But of our 20 players that would play in a game each night, we would have about 18 of them, probably sometimes 18 to 19 guys, only like one or two guys didn't lift pre-game. And we would do very low volume, 1 to 3 sets of 1 to 3 reps of some heavy lifts, whether it be a hex bar deadlift, a back squat sort of off the safety pins at a higher range, things like that, to kind of micro dose that sort of high end strength. And what we found was that a lot of those players were able to slowly improve their strength across the season. And whereas a lot of teams would, including myself in the past, would traditionally lift maybe post game, do a little bit of volume, or post practice, a little bit of volume, we basically said we're going to lift pre game, we're going to lift pretty heavy, obviously with some undulations based on the game, but we're going to lift pretty frequently and pretty heavy and just a really low volume. Post game can just be about recovery. You can hop on the bike and do some zone two recovery work for 10, 20 minutes. You can go right to the treatment table and get a rub down. You can go into, the sauna or the cold plunge and do some contrast. And I think that really benefited our recovery without having to compromise on our lifting schedule and our lifting demand. So, we had players hit PRs and PBs throughout the season, kind of three-quarters of the way towards the end of the season before pulling off a little bit in playoffs. And it was just by nature again of those sort of pre-game heavy short bouts of lifting, and that worked really well for our group. And there was a couple guys who did more post-game lifting or did more practice lifting because maybe they're are able to handle a little bit for more volume. They might be a little bit more parasympathetically dominant, and then that's something that they're able to succeed and almost feel better with. That's where the individualization I think becomes very key. So anytime you have a team of 25 players or 23 players kind of thing, you're going to have your base program or your base style, and then you're going to have to make slight modifications for different players. And the pregame lifting pretty heavy and in very small doses was I think a very effective strategy for us this year.
Nice, nice. Because obviously can't say which team it is, but like there are some few teams in the league they don't believe in uh post game lift, and somehow I know some of them do pregame. I know some of them do the day after the game, and somehow they are like one of the healthiest team in our league.
So you're saying that team kind of does a mix of everything, and they're one of the healthiest teams?
No, so we got two teams. One
Yeah.
team do the lift the day after the game,
Okay.
and one team do pregame. They don't do
Yeah.
postgame. And those
Okay.
two are like compared to league average, they're like
Yeah.
two of the healthiest.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, it's obviously good to learn from like different sport. Like NBA been doing this post game lift for a long time, and it's like across the board, almost every team do that.
Yeah.
And somehow like we're getting more and more injury.
Yeah.
And like obviously like learning from you, learning from baseball, I feel like we can like get a lot more and try to like maybe help our athletes be better and
Yeah.
healthier.
I mean, there's great research behind the potentiating effects of lifting, you know what I mean, in intense in small volumes. And I remember I had a colleague who actually worked in the NBA for a little while, and him and I had we'll go back and forth all the time on this idea of what is the state of the tissue after a game, and what is the state of the nervous system after the game, and how does that lend itself to one strategy or another. And we have some players who skate 2.5 to 3 miles over 23 minutes. And then we have some players who skate like half a mile over 8 minutes. That's a very different actual output. So how do you give those two the same or different lifting protocols? Um, but at the same time, what we would often argue about was at the end of a game, are you more metabolically fatigued or neurologically fatigued? And the my colleague would argue that post game, the adrenaline's still running, your nervous system is buzzing. It's a good chance to lift heavy. And I would say that, I don't know, because you've also your nervous system has been turned on, or you've been, focused and paying attention for 3 straight hours. It's that idea, I think, of like when you're driving in the rain at night and you're, white knuckling it and you're holding, and but when you get to the hotel finally, you're just like, oh, I can relax. And you haven't moved an inch, but you've just been so zoned in, and it requires so much attention that you're just neurologically fatigued. And I always love this story. I heard it from a guy who came to work with one of the teams I used to work with, and he was a Navy SEALs trainer. Used to do like the BUDS training, and he said like when they would do their parachute training day, you basically just pack your parachute, walk to the plane, go up to 30,000 feet or whatever, jump down, pack your parachute, go back up, do it again. You probably do 6 jumps in the run of a day. So you talk about the actual like if you had data metrics on it, they walked 800 feet. You know what I mean? They didn't move in the air, obviously. They were floating. There was no, contact with the tissues sort of thing. But you can imagine the neurological arousal of jumping out of an airplane would be incredibly high. And he said at the end of the day, those guys were just wiped. So it's like, why are you so fatigued from walking 800 feet over 12 hours or whatever? Well, that's neurological fatigue, and that's a very real thing. And if you're neurologically fatigued post game, then I don't know if you're able or in a good position to handle high intensity loads, whether it's a heavy hex bar, a heavy squat, or something like that. So I think you just need to ask that question maybe with each athlete or your group of players and say, do these post game lifts fit for us? And then by the same token, if the team's going to lift the next day, well, what state is your nervous system going to be in the next day? Because hockey players tend to have a hard time. There's a lot of caffeine pre-game as a performance enhancement supplement. You're not going to bed till 1, 2, sometimes 3 in the morning for some guys, depending on who the guy is. And the next day you're coming in sleep a little bit sleep deprived. You've had some, local muscular tissue damage from either contact or just playing. Almost everybody is tired and fatigued that day. So I don't think that's a great day to lift heavy either. Okay, well, now we're running out of opportunities of when the nervous system will be fresh, the tissue will be fresh, and we won't detract from our on ice performance in the games. We're running out of opportunities to lift. And that's why I think the pregame lift for us works really well, because it allowed us to pump recovery after the game, pump recovery the next day, and then get right back on the horse the day after that with a much more fresh nervous system and body and do that quick high intensity lift pre-game.
Nice, nice. I know you're busy, but I do want to share this. I think somewhere around 2 years ago, I was talking to a physical therapist that obviously work in the NBA, and we are talking about post-game lift. And I was like, and when you say like the central nervous system is still like exposed to like high intensity, I feel like uh maybe sometimes this is just me random thinking. Maybe sometimes like the central nervous system is so excited that potentially inhibits some like pain or I don't know, bruise or some like small tissue damage that they potentially can handle. But if you add load and intensity after that, they probably inhibit the pain so they don't feel the pain. But the next day, like you're probably gonna
Yeah.
feel something.
It's great. It's a great point. And again, I think that's just another layer or lens you have to look at when you're assessing, should we lift post game, should we not? We'll ask the question too, do we have a day off tomorrow? Okay. So if they're already a little bit compromised tomorrow, well, it's a full day off. They can just lay around. It gives them a little extra time. Maybe we can, functionally overreach for this day. But we'll also look at that in terms of, well, when did we lift last? And when are we going to lift again? If we're about to go on the road, we're going to have a game day off, then we're going to fly out to another city and be gone for a week. Generally, you don't get great lifts on the road and less equipment, not as good as your home gym. So maybe we do need to do a lift on that day because we're not going to get one for a week. So that kind of works into the equation or the math of does it make sense to do a post game lift? And I think like you're talking about, that's just another question to ask and layer of the process to ask when you're trying to determine if you want to lift pre-game, post-game, day after, that kind of thing.
Nice. Last topic before I let you go.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've been working with uh pro sport for a long time, and uh you were doing your own thing, and then as an assistant strength coach with Pittsburgh, and then now you're the head strength coach. So going through all that, like obviously a lot of young coaches want to be where you at with maybe hockey, football, Major League Baseball, whatsoever. What are some advice you'd give to like young coaches or like even uh 10 years ago, like yourself, to like, yeah, what are some advice?
I love this question and I get it a lot. And for me, it's a very easy answer. I think the strength and conditioning and the rise of sports science has made people much more interested in the data and the numbers and the technologies, and that's great if that's your passion for data and coaching and for data and movement and stuff like that. That's great. If you want to be a coach, if you want to be a Dan Paff style of person, Dan is obviously a very unique individual, but Dan has watched more people run with his own eyes and watched more people lift with his own eyes than almost anybody in the world. So my advice to a young strength coach is get on the floor and coach. The more people you coach, the more bodies you see, the more movements you try to assess and make mistakes and figure it out and try this drill and make up your own drill and try to apply a new thing. That makes you better. My biggest training, I have an undergrad degree in kinesiology, a master's in corrective exercise, things like that. Like those are pieces of the puzzle, but I spent the majority of my young professional life basically mirroring or following one strength coach and just watching the way he worked every day. And life was a lot simpler when I wasn't married with kids and I had a lot more time to myself. But I used to just watch him work with people and ask questions and just ask questions. And him and I would talk for hours sometimes just about why'd you choose this drill? Why not move this way? I don't feel that. Why do you feel that? Why wouldn't you do this? It makes more sense to me if you do this. And that's how you get better. That's how you start to train that coach's eye that I think the really great coaches have. And my coach's eye is nowhere near that of a Dan Paff or an Andy O'Brien or a Bill Knowles or someone like that. But the only way that I'm ever going to get close to that is by watching more, by putting more in front of those eyes. And I would tell them to get on the floor, train people, try things, do as much as you can. The real experience you'll gain is working with athletes on the floor. And I think that's my number one advice is work with people, work with people, work with people, try to solve problems, try to solve movement problems, try to help performance, ask really good questions, ask a lot of questions. And I think you'll be in a really good spot.
Nice, nice. That's all the question I have for you today. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. That was a great chat.